I have never set out to affect people. All I ever set out to do was write stories that I hoped the readers would enjoy. And in the beginning, the only thing I hoped was that they would enjoy the stories, therefore they would buy the books, therefore I would keep my job and not get fired, therefore I could keep paying the rent. And, I mean, it was only years later that I would hear people say how much these stories might have affected them. But at the time of writing them, my only interest was just to write a good story, which hopefully would be well received by the readers. I had created quite a number of heroes before Daredevil. There was Peter Parker, Spider-Man, who had all sorts of personal problems. In fact, all of my characters had personal problems or hang-ups or handicaps of some sort. So my job was to keep creating superheroes, so when I had to do a new one, the first thing I thought of was, what kind of handicap can I give somebody? Now, I think I had already done the mighty Thor, the Thunder God, and in his human identity, he limped, he was lame, and used a cane. And all of them had something. Iron Man had a weak heart. I had very strange heroes. At any rate, it occurred to me, what if I had a hero who was blind? Because I had known a blind person who I marveled at his ability to function in many ways. And he seemed to hear better than most people because he had his hearing had to be sensitive because he depended on it so much. And I thought, if I could get a blind man who developed his other senses to an extravagant degree, who had super senses, and show that he could function better than a sighted man, even though he was blind. And that idea fascinated me. I remember I thought, if his sense of touch was incredibly sensitive, he wouldn't need Braille, but he could run his finger over a newspaper and the ink itself, he could feel that. So he could read just by doing that, read a page faster than a sighted man could. And I felt he could even tell if you were lying, because his hearing would be so acute that he could hear if your heartbeat was speeding up and your pulse. Therefore, it was like having a built-in lie detector. And I began to think of all these qualities. You know, your sense of balance comes from your ear. A tightrope walker or someone like that, they use their balance from their ear. So if his hearing was so acute, he could do anything that a circus performer could do. He could be a trapeze star, a tightrope walker, and so forth. He could walk on telephone wires from the poles in the street. I began to think of all the scenes we could get. The more I thought about it, the more I loved this character. And I must say, I still do. As you probably know, once you have the superhero identity, you have to figure, well, what does the hero do in his normal civilian life? So I thought, and I always like to try to do something different, as most writers do. I thought, what type of occupation in civilian life isn't any other hero involved in? And I thought, gee, if I made him a lawyer, first of all, there are no other lawyers in comics that I knew of. And secondly, I could get some interesting story plots just because, and I could find reasons for him to get involved with villains because people could come to him with cases, tell him some terrible thing that happened and they need help, not knowing he's a hero. And also, I could use him as a guest star in other books because whenever somebody needed a lawyer, they could go to Matt Murdock. So I thought the idea of him being a lawyer was great. And when I was a kid, I had seen a movie, I think it was called The Great Mouthpiece, about a lawyer. And he stood up there in front of the jury and he made impassioned speeches, and he got his defendants, who were all innocent, he got them off. And I thought, I'm a very corny guy. I thought, how dramatic to be able to go up there and make a speech. It's like being an actor. So I always think I always wanted to be a lawyer in the back of my mind. It never occurred to me it's also hard work, and you've got to sit with text and read reviews and reports. I just thought you make speeches, and I love doing that. So I made him a lawyer. And today, a lot of lawyers are very unpopular. But when I did that, I guess it was about 40 years ago, lawyers were just like anybody else. Over the years, so many different writers have written Spider-Man and changed him a little bit. Each new writer has a different take on him. Each new writer has had a different take on Daredevil. All I can tell you about is in the beginning, when I first wrote the Spider-Man stories and the Daredevil stories in the beginning, Daredevil was an adult, and he was very interested in helping other people who had problems as a lawyer and as a superhero. He was in love with a girl. Her name was Karen Page, I believe. She was his partner, and he had a firm called Nelson and Murdoch. He was partnered with Foggy Nelson. And this girl, Karen, was their secretary. She loved him and he loved her, but he wouldn't marry her because he felt it was unfair to ask her to marry a blind man, not realizing she would have given anything to be his wife. So I had that romance going. Now, I think over the years that's changed. I think Karen has changed and a lot has happened. But in those days, he was a grown-up with a real romance. When I wrote Peter Parker, Spider-Man, he was a teenager. He wasn't quite as interested in helping other people who came to him for help. It didn't work that way. He was mostly fighting people who, for their own reason, wanted to destroy Spider-Man. And simply because he was Spider-Man, he had so many enemies. His romances were a little bit lighter. There were girls he liked, might have thought he loved, but as a teenager, he went from one to another. And finally, after a number of years, I had to marry this girl, Mary Jane. So there was a difference in feeling. Daredevil, I think, was always a little bit more serious. Spider-Man had more humor to it. I had him wisecracking a lot. And the stories in some ways were lighter. And aside from that, there was a great similarity, though, because they both fought very colorful, costumed villains. And I always felt if you have a young teenager and he's fighting villains who are enormously powerful, that's interesting. And if you have a blind attorney and he's fighting villains who are colorful and powerful, that's interesting too. So because of the fact that they were two basically normal people, I tried to give both of them villains who were very much they were exaggerated in every way, in their power and in their appearance. And I must say, I have a great love for both Spider-Man and Daredevil. Obviously, Spider-Man and Daredevil are friends. And it was the most natural thing in the world for me to make all our superheroes. See, one thing we did that was different than other comic book companies, I placed all these characters in the same world and in the same city. They all were in New York, which made it easy for them to run into each other and guest star in each other's books. Now, by having them all living in essentially the same place, and by having them all do essentially the same things, what could be more natural than to make them friends, especially when they would meet and have to fight together? Of course, I also did a lot of stories where due to misunderstandings, they would get mad at each other, or one might think another one had committed a crime. Couldn't believe it, but still he knew he had to go after him, and that always made it interesting, and it was always a surprise to the readers. And one of the most important things you can do in writing these sort of stories is surprise the readers. But there was something about Spider-Man and Daredevil that I felt they were so similar in so many ways that I wanted them to definitely be friends. And I'm happy to say it worked out that way in the books. I have never really eavesdropped on Spider-Man and Daredevil when they were alone. I felt it wouldn't be right. I mean, even a hero needs his privacy. But I'm going to take a guess about what they would talk about when they got together for a sandwich or something somewhere. I would guess the first thing they would talk about were the last few villains that they had come up against. And being normal people, both of them, my guess is they would each try to top the other. Hey, your fight against Kingpin, yeah, that was okay. You did a good job. But you should have seen me against the Green Goblin. Man, that was really something. You know, at least that's the way I would write their dialogue if I was writing it. After they finish talking about the various fights they've had with the various villains, I would imagine that they'd start talking about their personal lives. Hey, how's Mary Jane? Are you still seeing her? Is everything okay? Yeah, fine. And what about Karen? When are you two going to get married? And what, things like that. Well, after they had run through that, I imagine they'd talk about sports, politics, and at some point they'd get bored and they'd figure that's enough. And they'd figure, okay, that's long enough. There must be some bad guys out there I ought to be fighting. And they would take off. All imaginary on my part. The one thing about being the writer and the editor and art director of these books, which I was in the beginning, is you're a little bit like God. You can create anything, you can kill anything, you can say that character's too short, I'll make him taller, or you can change anything. Well, when we did the Daredevil story, the first one, that was illustrated by Bill Everett, a very talented artist, a good friend of mine. He had created the Submariner character years ago. And I let Bill create whatever costume that he wanted for Daredevil. And he gave him that costume, which was mostly yellow. And I somehow, after the first issue or the first couple of issues, it just didn't seem dramatic enough. And I thought the word devil, and when you think of devil, you think of flames, you think of Hades, and so forth. And I said, let's give him a red costume. So as I say, being the art director, if I wanted to give him a red costume, they gave me a red costume. So we redesigned a red costume, and I liked that one much better. And it was just as simple as that. I thought that the yellow just was it was a little too old-fashioned comic booky. Now, certainly any costume is comic booky, but I thought the red was more dramatic. The Marvel characters come in all sizes and shapes and varied assortments. Some of them just seem to fit so beautifully in teams, like the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and even Iron Man and Captain America, who are part of the Avengers, and so forth. But some characters seem better suited to be loners. They could meet other characters, they could guest star in other books, but generally, I might be wrong, but the way I felt was Daredevil and Spider-Man should always be loners. In fact, I remember I wrote a story once where Spider-Man wanted to join the Fantastic Four, and he applied, and he was very surprised when he learned they didn't pay salaries to people. So he left and decided to be a loner. But I can't explain why. It's just a feeling I have. Daredevil by himself is a very dramatic and a very engrossing character. And I think he'd sort of lose a lot of his uniqueness if he were part of a team. And the thing about Spider-Man, he's always been a loner, and I feel he should be. I know that Kingpin originally first appeared in the Spider-Man series. He was a Spider-Man villain. Then, before we knew it, he was one of Daredevil's top villains. And it just happened. See, I was very generous with the villains. I would give them to any superhero that needed one or wanted one. And we did. We had the villains move back and forth. I had a villain named Dr. Doom who had appeared with every character at some time or other, and a lot of them. But somehow, when we first put Kingpin in with Daredevil, it worked so well because Daredevil was such a realistic character, being a lawyer, being blind. I mean, he seemed so real. And of all the villains, because of the fact that he didn't wear a costume, and he lived in the city, and he was just a gangster, although nobody knew it, to the world he was a big businessman, it seemed this lawyer and this businessman worked so well together in a series, and nobody knew the lawyer was really Daredevil, the businessman was really the Kingpin, and he became one of Daredevil's top villains. I guess heroes are people who help other people, who do things for other people. And man, that can refer to a mother, a father, a child. It certainly refers to firemen, policemen, soldiers. But anybody can be a hero. Anybody who helps another human being, or even an animal. I mean, anybody who puts himself or herself out to help someone else is doing something that's heroic. Now, in comic books, we call them superheroes because they do more than a normal man can. Just for fun, we give them superpowers. But again, a hero is somebody who helps others and who is admirable, who you'd look up to and you'd say, gee, I wish I were like that, or I'd like my children to be like that. To me, that's a hero. I had school teachers who I think were heroes because they inspired me and they made me want to be as good as I could be at whatever I did. Now, those teachers didn't get any prizes and there weren't books written about them, but as far as I'm concerned, they were very heroic. They gave of their time and energy, they cared about their students, and they did the best they could for them. And I mean, you could be a supermarket checkout clerk and be a hero in your own way if you're good to the people that you work with. Anybody could be a hero, I think.